It was a warm summer evening in London. Sisters Biba and Nicole went to the park to celebrate one of their birthdays together. Unfortunately, they didn't know that a wicked monster was hiding among the trees and had been watching them for a long time. And before we get started, be kind enough to support my channel. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and stay active. It will help a lot. I will be very grateful to you for that. Let's get started. Today's story took place in the northwest of London relatively recently, in June 2020. It was a beautiful sunny day, the day Biba Henry was celebrating her 46th birthday. She and her younger sister Nicole decided to go to Friant Park, where a few friends and relatives were supposed to join them. There wasn't going to be a big celebration, since it was 2020, during the pandemic. At that time, the full lockdown in the United Kingdom had already ended. People were now allowed to go outside and even gather in small groups, while still observing social distancing. That's why many citizens, tired of staying indoors for so long, were happy to go out to parks and enjoy the fresh air. Nicole Smallman was Biba's half-sister. There was a 19-year age gap between them. Nicole was 27, and Biba had just turned 46. Despite that, the sisters were very close and had recently been living together. When Nicole was attending university, it was a long commute back home for her. But Biba had rented a place near the college. There was a spare bedroom in the older sister's apartment, so she invited the younger one to stay and live with her for a while. Both women were daughters of the former Archdeacon of Chelmsford, Wilhelmina, Mina Smallman. Mina, who retired in 2019, was the first woman from an ethnic minority to hold the title of Archdeacon in the Anglican Church. Biba Henry was happy that the weather turned out so beautiful for her birthday, so she invited her few guests for a picnic in the park. The gathering was set for 8 in the evening, when the daytime heat had given way to a gentle nighttime coolness. The sisters brought pillows from home, spread out blankets, took out snacks, and set up a small party. The group had a great time. They laughed, told stories, took pictures, and enjoyed the warm evening. Time flew by, and when all the guests had left, it was already midnight. Biba and Nicole were in no hurry to return home. For the celebration, they had brought a large string of lights to the park and hung it on the trees to create a magical atmosphere. And now, they were taking pictures of each other against the backdrop of the sparkling lights. The sisters were having a wonderful time, even after being left alone. But they didn't know that a stranger had been watching them from behind the bushes for a long time. The next morning, Nicole's boyfriend woke up and found that the other half of the bed was empty. His girlfriend had never come home that night. The young man checked his phone. It turned out that Nicole hadn't even bothered to send a message saying she wouldn't be coming home and would be staying at her sister's place. The last thing she had sent him were the words, "I'm dancing in the park." That was at 1:06 a.m. The boyfriend tried to call Nicole, but the call immediately went to voicemail. Then he dialed Biba's number, but her phone was turned off too. All of this was very strange, since Nicole had never acted like this before. She always let someone know in advance if her plans changed, and she certainly never turned off her phone. The boyfriend tried to reach out to the girl's friends and her family, but no one knew where the sisters could have gone. The relatives were slightly comforted by the fact that Biba and Nicole were both grown women. Maybe their phones had died. Instead of going home, the sisters might have had a crazy idea, like continuing the celebration somewhere else. At the time, the family tried not to panic and to think positively. For the rest of the day, the relatives kept calling the girls, texting them, and asking friends who had been at the party the night before. They even went to Biba's apartment, but no one was there. No one had seen or heard anything about the sisters. It was as if both women had vanished into thin air. There were very few reasonable explanations left for Nicole and Biba's disappearance. When the clock showed 9 p.m., almost a full day after the party in the park, the girl's mother, Mina Smallman, called the police and reported her daughters missing. By that time, the woman was seriously alarmed. All kinds of thoughts were running through her head. Maybe something had happened to her girls and they were in a hospital, or maybe they had gotten lost in the dark and became victims of an abduction. Mina provided the police with information about her daughters, their photographs, and described the location where they were supposed to celebrate the birthday. As expected, she waited for the officers to check the park first, but for some reason, law enforcement didn't do that. They took her statement, collected the women's photos, and simply returned to the police station to go about their routine business. The strangest part was that an investigation had supposedly started, but no one actually checked the last known location of the missing women. The family was confused. Although the police insisted they were working on the case, there was no evidence to support that. Nicole and Biba's mother had a growing suspicion that detectives were in no hurry to act, and that the reason was the victim's skin color. Mina was African American, as were both of her missing daughters. The male police officers didn't want to make an effort to search for black women. The whole family was disappointed and upset by the lack of urgency in the case, so the relatives decided to take the investigation into their own hands. They had no other choice, because they couldn't just sit around and wait. And since, for some reason, the officers weren't planning to search the park, the family decided to do it themselves. They spent the entire morning making missing person flyers for Biba and Nicole and posting on social media. By evening, they had made it to the park. By that point, Mina had already called all the hospitals in the area, asking if 2 women matching her daughter's descriptions had been admitted. But there was no solid information about any victims. Before heading to the park, the family organized something like a search party, which included several people who had been at Biba Henry's birthday celebration. Friends led the Smallman family members to the picnic site, but there were no signs of the missing sisters. There were no string lights, no blankets or pillows, no personal belongings of Biba or Nicole. Nothing that they had brought with them to the park that day. A glimmer of hope appeared. Maybe the girls had packed everything up and gone home. But if that were the case, then what could have happened to them on the way? The search party was already about to leave the park when one of them noticed Biba's sunglasses lying in the grass. Sunglasses she never went outside without during the summer. At first glance, it seemed like she might have simply dropped them in the dark. But for some reason, the discovery left an unsettling impression, as if something sinister was hidden behind those glasses left in the grass. That was what pushed the relatives to search the bushes and examine the grass around the picnic spot more thoroughly. And soon, they made a horrifying discovery. On the ground, they found a large knife, smeared with something red. It was lying just a few meters from the clearing where Biba and Nicole had celebrated the birthday. This discovery shattered the last hopes of finding the women alive and well. The family and friends feared that the sisters were already dead, since they hadn't made contact at all during all this time. Fear and emptiness quickly turned into anger toward the police, because it was the officers who should have searched the park right away and found that knife. The relatives immediately called emergency services and reported the discovery to the dispatcher. The operator told them to stop searching immediately, not to touch anything else, and to wait for the police to arrive. The problem was that the family had already waited 2 days for investigators to take the case seriously, but nothing had happened. The only progress in the case came solely because the family had taken the search into their own hands, so they ignored the dispatcher's instructions and kept searching. While the rest of the group carefully examined the clearing again, Nicole's boyfriend wandered off a little toward the trees by himself. He was trying to put himself in the shoes of a potential attacker, and guess what their next move would have been? That's when the rest of the group heard him let out a guttural, blood-curdling scream. Everyone immediately ran toward the trees. When they saw the young man, he was crying, screaming, and pointing at something on the ground. It was the lifeless body of his girlfriend, Nicole. She was curled up in a fetal position, pressed tightly against the body of her older sister, Biba. The sisters and their clothes were covered in blood, and their arms were intertwined, as if they had been hugging each other. It was clear the killer had staged it that way, and even without an autopsy, it was obvious the women had been stabbed to death. There were visible stab and slash wounds on their skin, mostly on the abdomen and arms. Clearly, the sisters had fought back until the very end, and the knife that had been found earlier was most likely the murder weapon. 27-year-old Nicole Smallman and 46-year-old Biba Henry were brutally murdered in the park on the night of the older sister's birthday. Their disappearance case was immediately reclassified as a double homicide investigation. News of the case spread across London instantly, and no one could believe what had happened. Henry and Smallman were respected members of their communities. Biba was a social worker who always approached her profession with great dedication. Her colleagues described her as a passionate advocate for the protection of vulnerable children and families. Despite having a fiery temper, she always treated people kindly. She was a friendly and confident woman. Nicole worked as a freelance photographer. She was very creative and super artistic. Both sisters were known as fun, sociable, and free-spirited women. Their tragic deaths were a huge loss to everyone who knew them. When the police finally arrived at the crime scene, they cordoned off the entire area with yellow tape and called in a forensic team. To ensure that no passers-by stumbled upon the bodies, patrol officers were stationed nearby, and as it turned out, those patrol officers were absolutely vile and cruel individuals who didn't deserve to wear the proud title of officer. 48-year-old Denise Jaffer and 33-year-old Jamie Lewis were assigned to guard the crime scene. They were supposed to stand just a few feet from the bodies and make sure no one approached them. But apparently, they got bored standing around doing nothing. Instead of protecting the dignity and honor of the crime victims, they started taking photos with the murdered sisters' bodies in the background. After goofing off and having what they seemed to think was a good time, the officers shared these images in a group chat on a messaging app. The chat included over 40 members, many of whom were also police officers. It was a work-related group. Colleagues asked Denise and Jamie what they were up to, and in an attempt at a joke, they sent selfies with the sisters' dead bodies and an offensive caption. The murdered Biba and Nicole were referred to by the two officers as daft birds. In the United Kingdom, as in many other countries, calling women daft birds is considered a derogatory and demeaning slur. And here were two law enforcement officers who were supposed to protect the public, mocking the remains of two slaughtered women. It was, at the very least, inhumane and cruel. It felt as if Nicole and Biba weren't even considered human. Fortunately, not everyone was so heartless. Several police officers from that group chat were appalled by the mockery of the victims' remains and immediately reported Denise and Jamie to their superiors. The two were promptly suspended from duty and later arrested and charged with misconduct. Investigations were also launched against 6 other officers who had either viewed the photos or were aware of them, but failed to report the incident to higher authorities. It was later revealed that this wasn't the first time the two patrolmen had behaved inappropriately toward people of other races. They had previously covered up crimes committed against Asians and African Americans. For instance, Denise Jaffer had boasted about hiding an attack on an Asian boy, or letting 3 white men go without even filing a report. As a result, in December 2021, the 2 officers were sentenced to 2 years and 9 months in prison. And although they only served half of their sentence, they will never again be allowed to work in law enforcement. The autopsy reports for Biba and Nicole were horrifying. The pathologist concluded that the older sister died first. She sustained 8 stab wounds. No defensive injuries were found on her body. It appeared that she died very quickly. Most likely, she didn't even have a chance to react or fight for her life. The younger sister suffered 28 different stab wounds and more than a dozen cuts. When the attacker went after Biba, Nicole tried to pull him away from her sister. That's when the assailant turned on Nicole, and a one-sided struggle began. Judging by the defensive wounds, the young woman fiercely fought back against the attacker. The autopsy reports also stated that the victims' bodies had been dragged across the ground. This was indicated by characteristic injuries found all along their backs. The attack took place at the picnic spot in the park, after which the killer dragged the women's bodies into the woods and arranged them as if they were hugging each other. The time of death for both sisters was estimated to be between 1:13 a.m. and 1:26 a.m. This specific time window was determined through physical evidence. After the attacker was done with the bodies, he disposed of all the picnic items. Blankets, pillows, handbags, and other personal belongings of the women were found dumped in the bushes near a lake in the same park. Biba's mobile phone played an important role in the investigation. That evening, the sisters had taken many pictures together. They had set the camera on a timer so it would take a photo every few seconds. The very last photo was taken at 1:13 a.m., and by 1:26 a.m., someone had attempted to unlock the phone, but the attempts failed. Police considered the theory that the killer, who had been watching the women from the bushes, saw them taking photos. Perhaps he feared he might have been caught in the frame and tried to delete the pictures, but was unsuccessful. Detectives working on the case had to analyze the photographs thoroughly. In one of the images, both sisters simultaneously raised their heads and looked in a specific direction. Investigators believed that this was the moment the attacker emerged from hiding. The women turned toward a noise and saw a stranger. During the crime scene examination, forensic experts discovered 3 different blood samples. The first 2 belonged to the sisters and were immediately identified. The third sample most likely belonged to the attacker. While fighting for her life, Nicole had wounded the assailant with his own weapon. That blood sample became one of the most crucial pieces of evidence in the case. All that remained was to identify the potential suspect and compare their blood with the unknown sample found at the scene. In 2003, a law was passed in the United Kingdom that allowed police to collect DNA samples from anyone who was arrested, regardless of whether they were ultimately charged with a crime or not. The DNA was uploaded into a national database, which became a valuable tool for future investigations. One of the key advantages of this database was that even if there were no exact DNA matches, the system could still identify partial matches. This meant that if a relative of the perpetrator had their DNA in the system, investigators could significantly narrow down the suspect pool using a partial match. That's exactly what happened in the case of the 2 sisters. The system showed a partial DNA match between the unknown sample from the crime scene and a sample belonging to an elderly man with the surname Hussein. This Mr. Hussein had never been charged with anything, but somehow his DNA had ended up in the police database. It became clear that someone in his close family circle was likely involved in the murder of the 2 women in Friant Park. From that point on, every member of the Hussein family, especially the younger ones, became subjects of police interest. Investigators gathered surveillance footage from the street where Mr. Hussein lived. They reviewed footage from the night of the murders and discovered something very interesting. In the early morning hours, a young man was seen running up the driveway to the Hussein residence. Strangely, he wasn't wearing any pants and had wrapped a jacket around his waist. The lack of clothing looked suspicious. Perhaps he had gotten blood on his pants and decided to get rid of them. The young man in the footage appeared to be a teenager. Investigators learned that Mr. Hussein had a teenage son, who quickly became the prime suspect. The boy's name was Danyal Hussein, and he was 18 years old. Despite his age, he already had a history with the authorities and had previously been referred to the government's Prevent program. In the UK, this program is designed to identify individuals at risk of radicalization before they act on their dangerous beliefs or intentions. The goal is to prevent such outcomes by offering support through a team of professionals, including police, psychologists, and social workers. Danyal had been referred to Prevent by his school. Teachers had discovered that he had been using school computers to search for and view suspicious content online. Danyal attended the sessions for 8 months. Eventually, the specialist concluded that he no longer posed a risk to society and scheduled follow-up evaluations 6 months and a year later to make sure he remained stable. A year later, Danyal was considered fully rehabilitated. Authorities believed he had learned his lesson and was no longer a potential threat. Danyal spent most of his time living with his mother in southeast London. His father, however, lived in the northwest part of the city, right near where the crime took place. Mr. Hussein's house was only a few minutes' walk from Friant Park. The father later admitted to police that he had been worried about his son for some time. He had a feeling that one day the police would come knocking with news of something terrible Danyal had done. And that day had finally come. Danyal Hussein was born on May 10, 2002. He was the oldest of 4 siblings. The boy was always antisocial and even aggressive toward those around him. He didn't get along with his family either. There were frequent clashes between him and his brothers and sisters, so intense that it sometimes required calling an ambulance or the police. Danyal didn't have any close friends or a girlfriend, so most of his emotional outbursts happened within the family. His peers didn't like Danyal. Many kids at school described him as creepy and repulsive, so he was always a loner. At the age of 15, Danyal was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, a form of autism spectrum disorder. Asperger's syndrome is a developmental disorder characterized by significant difficulties in social interaction, as well as restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior and interests. The term Asperger's syndrome is no longer used. It's an outdated diagnostic term. Nowadays, the condition is simply referred to as autism spectrum disorder. Danyal had a low need for support. His autism mainly manifested in social situations. He often felt depressed, and whenever something interested him, that interest would usually turn into obsession, another common trait of autism. Danyal found it very difficult to meet people, make friends, or communicate with girls. And yet, he desperately wanted to find a girlfriend. By the end of high school, Danyal was spending most of his free time on the computer, locked in his bedroom. And the biggest problem was the content he consumed and studied for hours. It included magical rituals, sacrificial offerings, real crimes, and similar topics. That's exactly what got him caught at school, leading to a referral to a prevention program. But Danyal didn't change. He just learned how to better hide his obsessions. In 2018, Danyal graduated from high school and enrolled in college, but he barely attended classes. Around that time, he became interested in demonology and became a fan of a social media blogger who promoted Satan worship. That blogger was named Matthew Lawrence, also known as Coetting. He was an American self-proclaimed occultist. He presented himself as a black magician who worked with the most destructive forces of the inner cosmos. Coetting was a member of the Order of Nine Angles, a group with a horrifying history of committing and encouraging vile acts such as terrorism, violence, and human sacrifice. All of this was supposedly done in service of Satan and demons. Coetting actively encouraged making deals with the devil and his servants to achieve specific goals. These deals usually involved fulfilling certain conditions in exchange for the desired outcome. Ketting's videos played a significant role in this case. During the pandemic, Danyal's mental state began to deteriorate. It became even darker and more troubling. He spent entire days watching videos on YouTube and was actively involved in an online forum called Become a Living God, dedicated to Satanism. Danyal practically worshipped Coetting and hung on to his every word. The forum's creator truly believed himself to be all-powerful and claimed that each of his followers could also gain power. All it took was making a pact with a demon and fulfilling a series of conditions. As already mentioned, Danyal was in a poor psychological state during isolation and was extremely vulnerable. He struggled with social issues and felt like he didn't belong. Girls didn't notice him, he couldn't control his life, and he was unable to achieve certain desires. Then came a mentor who claimed that anyone could get what they wanted, if they truly desired it. All they had to do was take someone's life to appease a demon. Danyal believed Ketting and began engaging with the forum. He called himself a psychic vampire and asked other members to give him advice on how to make a pact with demons. They gave him detailed instructions, which he followed precisely. So the police began to take interest in Danyal after spotting him on surveillance footage. Using those same cameras, detectives tracked the teenager's movements on the day of the sisters' deaths and his actions in the days leading up to it. On June 3rd, 2 days before the murder of Biba and Nicole, Hussein entered a local supermarket and bought drinks, a pack of gum, several candles, a couple of lemons, and a set of kitchen knives. As it was later confirmed, the knife found at the crime scene matched exactly with the knives from the set Danyal had purchased. Before that, he had ordered a balaclava online that covered his entire face, along with 2 folding shovels meant for digging a grave, but the order hadn't yet arrived. On June 5th, Danyal left his home at 7 p.m. The sisters were killed after 1 a.m. What he did during all that time remains unknown. It's possible he simply wandered around the park, searching for a potential victim. The match between the knife Danyal had purchased the day before and the murder weapon became a decisive piece of evidence for the police. They believed there was enough proof to arrest the young man on suspicion of the double homicide. Early in the morning on July 1st, 2020, police showed up at the home of Danyal Hussein's mother and arrested him. He was taken to the police station for questioning. Investigators noticed fairly serious cuts on his hand, which only reinforced their belief that they had the right person. When they asked him what had happened to his hand, Danyal struggled to come up with an answer. He stared at his hand in silence, then looked around as if trying to come up with something convincing. Eventually, he came up with a story about being attacked on the street during a robbery attempt. Everyone around could tell he was making it up on the spot. After Danyal Hussein's arrest, police searched both his mother's and father's homes. There, they found a large amount of material that explained the young man's motives. The teenager's bedroom looked like a shrine. Its walls were decorated with various satanic symbols printed on regular paper. On the desk lay a homemade book of spells, filled with all kinds of magical nonsense, like how to gain control over people or how to defeat your enemies. But the most disturbing thing police found in Danyal's bedroom was 2 handwritten contracts, created and signed by him in blood. It turned out Danyal had followed the instructions of his favorite YouTube blogger and had made 2 pacts with 2 different demons. One contract was addressed to the King of Hell, asking him to make a specific girl from Danyal's school, whom he had a crush on, notice him and believe that Danyal was the one she had been waiting for all her life. That contract was relatively harmless. The second contract, however, was an agreement between the young man and Lucifuge Rofocale. Lucifuge is a demon, the so-called Prime Minister of Hell, who, under Lucifer's orders, heads Hell's government and controls all earthly treasures. In this second contract, Danyal essentially pledged to become a serial killer and offer regular human sacrifices to this demon. In the first part of the contract, Danyal laid out step by step how he would fulfill the agreement, promising to deliver at least 6 victims every 6 months. He specified that the victims would all be women. He then guaranteed that he would build a temple in honor of this demon. The second part of the contract described what Danyal wanted in return. His first request was to win the lottery. Not just any win, but specifically the jackpot. The teenager clarified that this could also come in the form of wealth and power obtained by other means, at the demon's discretion. In other words, he wanted a tangible reward in exchange for future sacrifices. Danyal's second request to the demon was that the police would never suspect him of any crimes. Both contracts were signed in Danyal's blood. He carefully wrote his name on the paper, scratching open his finger to do so. These agreements explained a lot about the boy's strange behavior. He had been acting in accordance with tutorial videos on YouTube, where Coetting instructed his followers on how to properly make contracts with demons. During questioning at the police station, the young man at first denied having any connection to the crime against the sisters. Then he stopped speaking altogether. Investigators pieced together all known facts and constructed an approximate timeline of the events that unfolded that night. So Danyal left his home at 7 p.m. Around midnight, he arrived at Friant Park. Under the cover of darkness, the young man remained unnoticed for quite some time. He watched Biba and Nicole while hiding behind the trees. Unfortunately, the women, absorbed in posing for photos, dancing, and enjoying themselves, weren't paying attention to their surroundings. Surrounded by the glowing string lights, they were completely exposed. Once the rest of the guests had left the park, Danyal focused on the 2 future victims. He already knew exactly how he would act, so the attack was swift. Danyal approached the women and launched a frenzied assault. First, he attacked Biba, stabbing her multiple times, then turned his attention to Nicole. She fought him, trying to save both her sister and herself. But Danyal was stronger and managed to overpower her. Afterward, he dragged the bodies into the wooded area of the park and, for some unknown reason, arranged them to appear as if the women were hugging each other. Then he returned to the picnic site and gathered all the evidence. He attempted to unlock the phone the sisters had used to take photos, but was unsuccessful. so he simply threw it on the shore of the lake, failing to toss it into the water. Before heading home, Danyal removed his blood-stained pants, apparently worried that his father might suspect something, and disposed of them as well. Since the pants weren't found among Biba and Nicole's belongings, he must have discarded them elsewhere. Danyal arrived home by 4 a.m., cleaned himself up, and calmly went to bed. The next morning, the wound on his hand began to bother him. Danyal went to the hospital, lying that he had been attacked on the street. He received stitches and was sent home without the incident being reported to the police. Over the next few days, Danyal kept a low profile and waited for the pact with the demon to take effect. He believed he had fulfilled his side of the bargain, and now he eagerly awaited a massive lottery win. Danyal had specifically purchased several lottery tickets, but none of them won. His plan for wealth had failed. It was all a delusion, but now he was a criminal who had taken the lives of 2 people. 18-year-old Danyal Hussein was formally charged about a month after committing the crime. His trial began a year later, in July 2021. Due to another outbreak of the virus, the defendant was not allowed to leave prison. He attended the court proceedings via video link. Danyal did not plead guilty, despite the overwhelming evidence. He fiercely denied all accusations against him and continued to claim that he had no idea who had attacked the 2 women in Bryant Park. During the live broadcast of the trial, Danyal showed complete disrespect for the judge. He turned away from the screen, smirked, and laughed at various moments, rocked back and forth in his chair, tossed his medical mask into the air like a misbehaving schoolboy, and treated the process as if it were a joke. It's very possible that Danyal fully understood he had no chance of escaping punishment, and that he would spend the rest of his life in prison for his crime. Aside from the previously diagnosed autism spectrum disorder, a psychiatric evaluation found no other mental illnesses. The defendant was deemed mentally sound and fully capable of taking responsibility for his actions. In the end, Danyal Hussein was found guilty of the deaths of Biba Henry and Nicole Smallman and was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 35 years. Danyal will be 54 years old when he becomes eligible for parole. There is no guarantee he will ever be released, because a rational person who decides to exchange human lives for a lottery win should not be allowed back into society. After all, if Nicole Smallman hadn't bravely fought back and injured the hand holding the weapon, Danyal could have easily attacked more people that night. That young woman potentially saved several lives by sacrificing her own. The investigation sparked wide public debate about women's safety, police misconduct, and the dehumanization of people with darker skin. The victim's mother, Mina Smallman, called on the head of the Metropolitan Police to resign over the way the investigation was handled, and he did so in February 2022. The former Anglican priest also criticized the media for not giving enough coverage to the disappearance of her daughters. If 2 white people had been killed in a park, reporters would have broadcast it all over the United Kingdom. The case also triggered a conversation about the accessibility of harmful online content that influenced the teenager and pushed him to act. As a result, Matthew Lawrence's videos were removed from YouTube, and his social media accounts were banned for promoting violence. As for Danyal Hussein himself, his pact with the devil was fulfilled in a way. The girl he had been in love with did eventually notice him, but instead of love, he filled her with absolute disgust.